They say machines carry the mood of the era in their metal, and few aircraft wore the mood of the Pacific War as plainly as the F4U Corsair. Born from a demand for speed, firepower and survivability, it arrived like a promise. A fighter that could escort, fight and break things on the deck. For American pilots, it became whistling death. For Japan, it was something else. A shock, then dread, then begrudging respect. This is the story of what the Imperial Japanese forces really thought of the Corsair, told not as propaganda, but as a slow, hard-learning conversation between two very different air wars. When the Corsair first rolled into its trials, engineers were chasing a simple set of orders: more speed, more power, more punch. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp at its heart was an unapologetic lump of power, a two-row radial designed to fling airframe and pilot through the sky with an urgency the older generation of fighters couldn't match. But raw horsepower creates problems: large engine, heavy torque, long nose. The answer was the Corsair's trademark silhouette, the inverted gull wing. That bent wing wasn't a styling quirk. It shortened the landing gear, cleared huge propeller arc, and made the airframe compact enough to put a monstrous propeller on a carrier-capable fighter. What looked odd in hangars read it as brutal logic in the air. Japan saw all of that first as a shape, then as a sound. The Corsair's engine and propeller combination produced a howl, a musical, threatening wail that carried over ocean and field and became its nickname among Allied flyers: whistling death. For pilots and anti-air crews watching from below, the noise was a signature. In the dark, when a Corsair screamed in, it announced violence before it arrived. The first encounters, for the Japanese, and there were fewer than the Allies would later admit, were disorienting. Early in the war, the Imperial Navy and Army were handing defeats and improvising responses. Their fighters were designed around a doctrine that prized turn rate and low-speed dogfighting. The Corsair smashed those assumptions. In a zoom or a dive, the Corsair's energy reserves and acceleration were brutal. Where a lighter plane might lose speed and fall away, the Corsair ate height, converted it to speed, and returned with a punishing pass. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns were not a mere armament box. They were concentrated, devastating weight that could shred a fighter's control surfaces or blast an engine into silence with a single well-placed burst. But Japan's reaction was not uniform. At first there was confusion. Pilots reported machines that didn't behave like the Messerschmitts and Spitfires they understood. Field reports, pockets of dispatches, after-action notes, and the memories of pilots who survived describe a gradual reframe. Where once the enemy could be baited into a turning fight and dispatched with discipline, now a new rule emerged: don't trade energy for the Corsair. When faced with high-speed attackers that could dive out and return to altitude in moments, Japanese pilots had to adapt tactics or pay the price. What frightened Japanese airmen wasn't only the Corsair's raw performance, it was its combination of survivability and firepower. Unlike many contemporary fighters that bled to a single lucky hit, Corsairs could take flak, armor-piercing rounds, and still limp home. Their self-sealing tanks and cockpit protection mattered. Japanese reports and post-battle assessments noted, sometimes with bitter admiration, that Corsairs would return with wings shredded and control cables cut, yet the pilot could nurse them back to base. That resilience changed the math of attrition. Hitting an opponent became one thing, turning that hit into a kill became another. The Corsair's role extended beyond air-to-air combat. As the war shifted, the F4U found a brutal second life as a fighter bomber. Rockets, bombs, and strafing runs made it a terror to ground forces and installations. Japanese airfields, supply columns, bridges, all became targets for low-level, high-speed Corsair attacks. The psychological effect was huge. Ground crews learned that a screaming Corsair on a strafing run could destroy aircraft parked in the open, rip through fuel trucks, and wreck repair facilities in minutes. The consequence was not merely loss of material, it was a forced change in how Japan sheltered its assets, dispersed equipment, and attempted to defend against an aircraft that could come in hard and fast, hit with deadly precision, and get out before heavier defenses responded. There were doctrinal and technical responses from the Japanese side. Pilots increasingly sought ground-controlled interception that emphasized early warning and altitude denial. Anti-aircraft networks adapted by increasing density at critical points and refining gunnery solutions against fast-diving targets. Tactically, Japanese fighters attempted to exploit what they could. Head-on passes where the Corsair's frontal area became a larger target. Attempts to lure Corsairs into sustained low-speed engagements where their wing loading would hurt them, or concentrated fire on Corsairs' vulnerable belly areas during low-speed attack runs. These were not always successful. Corsair pilots learned to use boom and zoom, altitude advantage, and mutual support to blunt these counters. There are also the quieter human details that short reports miss. The effect on morale. Witness accounts and later memoirs reveal a creeping dread among ground crews and pilots who had seen a Corsair come in and tear up a strip or destroy a convoy. The aircraft's distinctive sound and its reputation for coming back from damage created stories that spread from field to field. Where once pilots counted on the predictable round of air combat, they now had to factor in an enemy that could punish mistakes with heavier cost. In many logbooks, the Corsair appears as an inflection point. The day a mission turned brutal. The encounter that cost lives. That said, Japanese thinking was never monolithic. Some commanders viewed the Corsair as another deadly opponent, but believed in countermeasures, dispersal, camouflage, improved early warning, and tactical patience. Others glimpsed the strategic reality. No single fighter could reverse the industrial tide. The Corsair's menace was amplified because it came with American logistics, numbers, and doctrinal evolution. As the Allies surged production, trained more pilots in energy tactics, and coordinated air-ground operations, the Corsair ceased to be an isolated terror and became a pillar in a system. For the Japanese, this was the cruelest calculation. The Corsair wasn't just a tough plane, it was part of a force that Japan could not match in scale or resource. The late war months crystallized that sentiment. The carriers that once projected power were being hunted. The skies were increasingly American. Corsairs prowled forward airstrips and, by then, many Japanese pilots had already learned the hard lessons. Their declassified communiques and post-war memoirs, the documents that later historians pieced together, show a pattern. Initial underestimation, followed by tactical adjustments, then a resigned respect. Phrases in recollections often trade the language of bravado for practical assessment. Fast, hard to catch, repaired and returned, and sometimes a wry, angry admiration for its toughness. There were limits, of course. Corsairs were not invincible. Skilled Japanese pilots exploiting local advantages, surprise, terrain, or the right weather could and did score kills. The nimble Zero could still outturn and surprise at low speeds, but those victories were increasingly tactical exceptions rather than strategic answers. The Corsair's combination of speed, firepower, and durability meant that localized success did not scale into broad operational reversal. What Japan thought of the Corsair then is less a single opinion than a trajectory. Shock, adaptation, assessment, and respect mingled with frustration. The Corsair forced a recalculation of air combat in the Pacific, not because it was elegant or graceful, but because it solved a problem the Japanese war machine could not. It solved the problem of delivering punishment reliably while surviving to fight another day. If you want a single image to close this, picture a late afternoon Pacific runway after a raid. The tarmac is scarred, a fuel truck burns in the distance, and a Corsair sits pockmarked with shrapnel but upright and whole. A Japanese ground crew coated in dust and sweat watches as the pilot climbs down on the Allied side and walks away. There's no flourish, just a hard, practical envy, the kind that acknowledges an adversary who did its job and came home. That is the essence of Japan's view. Not supernatural fear, not blind hatred, but a clear-eyed respect born of brutal experience. The Corsair did not win the war alone, but it was a machine that, more than most, forced the enemy to rethink how to live and fight under a new reality. For Japan, that reality was a lesson in industrial power, tactical evolution, and the cold arithmetic of attrition. The F4U was a demon in the sky, and when the smoke cleared, Japan's record is full of men who would remember it that way.